The sound that stayed with me wasn't the paper tearing. It was the laughter afterward. Sharp, careless, almost relieved. My stepdaughter Vanessa leaned back in her chair inside the conference room at Hollister & Bain LLP and dropped the ripped pieces of my husband's will onto the polished walnut table like confetti while her brother Ethan muttered, finally, under his breath. Nobody stopped them. Not even the attorney at first. The air conditioner hummed softly above us, cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms, and I remember staring at Richard's signature split clean through the middle while the receptionist outside continued answering phone calls like nothing extraordinary was happening. 3 weeks earlier, I had stood beside Richard's hospital bed at St. Mary's Oncology Center listening to his oxygen monitor beep through the night while Vanessa posted vacation photos from Napa Valley. But now I was the intruder. The opportunist. The second wife they claimed manipulated their dying father. Vanessa actually smiled at me and said, "You really thought Dad would leave you everything?" I didn't answer her. I simply folded my hands in my lap while Mr. Hollister reached slowly into his leather briefcase and said very calmly, "There is another document we haven't discussed yet." I met Richard 11 years earlier at a charity fundraising dinner in downtown Chicago, back when his construction firm was still recovering from the 2008 recession, and I was managing financial compliance for a healthcare network on the North Side. He was older, recently divorced, exhausted in a way that seemed permanent, and carrying the kind of loneliness wealthy men learn to disguise behind tailored jackets and expensive watches. His children never forgave him for marrying again after their mother remarried first, even though their divorce had been finalized for nearly 4 years before I entered the picture. At first the hostility was subtle: birthdays I wasn't invited to, family photos cropped carefully online, restaurant reservations changed without telling me. But after Richard's pancreatic cancer diagnosis in February 2024, the resentment hardened into something colder. I handled the medication schedules, insurance disputes, hospice coordination, overnight emergency calls, and even payroll when Richard became too weak to manage his own company accounts. Meanwhile, Vanessa and Ethan appeared only when lawyers, property valuations, or investment reports were mentioned. Still, I kept quiet. Because people reveal everything eventually when they believe you have no power left to protect yourself. The first time I realized Richard's children were already preparing for his death was 6 months before the funeral, during a Tuesday afternoon appointment at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Richard had just finished a brutal round of chemotherapy and fallen asleep in the recliner beside the window while I sat nearby sorting insurance approvals and medication receipts into labeled folders because the hospital billing department had incorrectly duplicated a $14,700 charge from March 18th. His phone buzzed on the side table beside me. Normally I never touched it, but the screen lit up repeatedly with messages from Ethan marked urgent. I glanced down only because I thought something had happened. Instead, I saw a thread discussing the valuation of Richard's lake property in Lake Geneva, and whether the trust still listed me as surviving beneficiary. Vanessa had written, "We need Dad to update everything before hospice starts because once she gets involved legally it'll become impossible." Ethan responded less than 2 minutes later, "Dad barely reads what he signs anymore." I remember staring at those words while the chemotherapy pump clicked quietly behind me and realizing, with absolute clarity, that they were no longer grieving in advance. They were strategizing. That night, after Richard finally fell asleep at home around midnight, I walked downstairs into his study and opened the locked filing cabinet where he kept estate paperwork, property deeds, business agreements, and tax records. Not because I intended to change anything. I simply needed to understand what they believed they were fighting over. The original estate structure had been written in 2019, and divided most assets equally between Ethan and Vanessa, while allowing me lifetime residency in the Chicago townhouse and monthly distributions from 2 investment accounts. Fair. Reasonable. But as I reviewed the documents, I noticed several missing files, specifically the updated power of attorney paperwork Richard mentioned signing earlier that year after his second hospitalization. 2 folders had clearly been removed recently because the dust outlines remained visible against the darker wood shelf beneath them. The next morning I asked Richard directly whether anyone had been helping organize his office while I was taking him to appointments. He looked confused for a moment before admitting Vanessa had visited alone 2 weekends earlier while I was in Milwaukee attending my aunt's funeral. According to Richard, she offered to simplify paperwork because he seemed overwhelmed. I said nothing immediately. Instead, I spent the following 3 weeks quietly documenting everything. Missing files. Sudden bank transfer inquiries. Unusual calls from Ethan to Richard's financial advisor. I even requested duplicate property records directly from Cook County after discovering someone had recently ordered certified copies of 2 commercial real estate deeds tied to Richard's company. What disturbed me most wasn't greed. It was the confidence. They behaved like ownership had already transferred emotionally before Richard was even gone. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was August 14th, Richard's 68th birthday, and despite his worsening condition, he insisted on hosting everyone at the townhouse because family should still look like family while there's time. Vanessa arrived 40 minutes late wearing a cream-colored blazer that still carried the tag tucked beneath the sleeve. Ethan spent most of dinner discussing market trends and interest rates while Richard struggled to finish half a bowl of soup. At one point Richard excused himself to rest upstairs, leaving the 3 of us alone at the dining table surrounded by untouched birthday cake and melting candles. Vanessa swirled wine slowly in her glass before looking directly at me and asking, "So have you figured out what you're going to do after?" I knew exactly what she meant. I asked calmly, "After what?" She smiled without warmth. "After all this." Then Ethan added almost casually, "Dad always intended his assets to stay in the family." The silence afterward told me more than their words ever could, because in that moment I realized they had already decided I wasn't part of it. 3 days after Richard's birthday dinner, I scheduled a private meeting with Daniel Hollister, the estate attorney who had handled Richard's business structures for nearly 20 years. I didn't tell Richard beforehand because I needed clarity before causing him additional stress, and by then his blood pressure had become dangerously unstable whenever conflicts surfaced around the children. The Hollister and Bain office overlooked the Chicago River from the 22nd floor. All glass walls and muted gray carpeting that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Daniel listened carefully while I explained the missing files, the hospital text messages, the deed requests, and Vanessa's increasingly aggressive questions about account access. He never interrupted. He simply folded his hands together and asked one question that changed the direction of everything. "Do you believe Richard fully understands what his children are doing?" I thought about it for several seconds before answering honestly. "I think he understands enough to be heartbroken by it." Daniel nodded slowly, then opened a secure folder on his computer and showed me something I hadn't known existed. A draft amendment Richard requested months earlier after Ethan attempted to pressure him into selling one of the company warehouses below market value. The amendment included behavioral clauses tied to interference, coercion, or destruction of estate documents. It wasn't finalized yet because Richard hesitated every time the conversation became emotionally painful. "He still wants to believe they'll come around," Daniel said quietly. That sentence stayed with me for days. Because despite everything, Richard still defended them constantly. When Vanessa ignored his radiation appointments, he claimed work stress. When Ethan demanded access to business accounts, Richard called it financial anxiety. He kept trying to preserve an image of family that no longer existed. But 2 weeks later, everything changed permanently. Richard collapsed at home just after 1 a.m. on September 6th, while trying to walk from the bedroom to the bathroom. I called 911, rode with him in the ambulance to St. Mary's, signed emergency treatment authorizations, and spent 11 straight hours beside him while doctors stabilized internal bleeding caused by advanced tumor progression. Vanessa arrived briefly around noon wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying an iced coffee. Ethan came later, stayed 19 minutes, then left after arguing with billing staff about insurance coverage. Neither returned that night. Around 2:30 a.m., while the intensive care floor fell nearly silent except for distant monitor alarms, Richard woke unexpectedly and asked me to bring his briefcase from home. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to Daniel Hollister. "I'm done pretending," he whispered. His voice sounded thin and uneven beneath the oxygen cannula taped across his face. "They think kindness means blindness." The following Monday, Daniel came directly to the hospital with 2 witnesses and a notary public. Richard amended everything. Not emotionally. Legally. Precisely. The townhouse transferred fully into a survivorship trust under my name effective immediately. 2 commercial properties moved into a charitable foundation Richard And I had quietly established supporting pancreatic cancer patients struggling with treatment costs. Ethan's inheritance became conditional upon maintaining employment for 3 consecutive years without litigation against the estate. Vanessa's distributions were restricted through monitored quarterly disbursements after evidence surfaced of concealed credit debt exceeding $190,000. Most importantly, Richard added a forfeiture clause. Any beneficiary who destroyed estate documents, harassed executors, or interfered with probate proceedings would automatically surrender their inheritance rights, except for a fixed minimal payout of $1. Daniel reviewed every page carefully while Richard signed with trembling hands. I remember watching the pen pause slightly above the final signature line before Richard looked at me and said, almost apologetically, "I should have protected you sooner." I squeezed his hand and told him the truth. "You just did." Richard died 52 days later on October 28 at 4:16 in the morning, while rain tapped softly against the hospice center windows. Vanessa cried loudly at the funeral. Ethan shook hands with business associates near the chapel entrance. And through all of it, neither of them had the slightest idea what their father finalized inside that hospital room. The will reading was scheduled for November 21 at 10 a.m., exactly 24 days after Richard's funeral, though Vanessa had already called Daniel's office 6 separate times demanding preliminary clarification regarding property distributions. By then I had moved through grief mechanically, surviving on routine more than emotion. I canceled Richard's remaining medical subscriptions, transferred utilities into my name, closed hospice accounts, and spent entire evenings sorting through condolence cards, while the townhouse felt unnaturally quiet without the sound of oxygen machines humming upstairs. What surprised me most was how quickly the children stopped pretending to mourn. Ethan contacted Richard's executive assistant, less than 48 hours after the burial, requesting access to pending company contracts. Vanessa appeared at the house unannounced, asking whether I planned to downsize soon. She said it while standing beneath the framed wedding photograph in our entry hallway. I remember noticing she never once asked how I was sleeping. By the morning of the will reading, the hostility had evolved into certainty. Vanessa arrived carrying a designer tote large enough to hold document boxes, while Ethan brought a legal pad already divided into categories labeled real estate, investments, and business assets. Daniel greeted everyone professionally but without warmth, and the entire atmosphere inside the conference room felt strangely transactional, like people arriving for a merger rather than discussing a dead man's life. The windows overlooked rainy downtown traffic below, while a tray of untouched pastries sat near the coffee station. Vanessa ignored me completely until Daniel began reviewing procedural language regarding probate timelines and executor responsibilities. Then she suddenly interrupted and asked, "Can we skip to the asset division?" Daniel adjusted his glasses carefully before opening the original 2019 estate binder Richard had intentionally instructed him to present first. I understood immediately what was happening. Daniel was giving them an opportunity to behave appropriately before revealing the amended documents. Instead, Vanessa practically exhaled in relief while Ethan leaned back smiling faintly as Daniel summarized the older distribution structure. "See," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Dad never changed anything." What happened next unfolded so quickly it almost felt rehearsed. Vanessa reached across the table, grabbed the binder directly from Daniel's hands, and flipped aggressively through the pages searching for property schedules. "This is what she's been hiding," she laughed. "Lifetime residency? Monthly distributions?" Ethan actually shook his head at me and said, "Unbelievable." Then Vanessa tore the first section straight through the middle. The sound sliced across the room sharply enough that even the receptionist outside looked through the glass wall. She ripped another page. Then another. "You were never family," she said while pieces scattered across the conference table beside Richard's signature pages. "You were a caretaker Dad got emotionally attached to." Ethan laughed quietly and added, "At least this saves probate time." I didn't respond, not because I was shocked, because I had already seen the forfeiture clause. Daniel, however, became completely still. He waited until Vanessa finally dropped the torn pages onto the table before removing a second sealed folder from his briefcase. Thick cream-colored paper marked estate amendment executed September 9, 2025. I watched Ethan's expression change first. Confusion, then caution. Daniel spoke very calmly after that. Before continuing, he said, I need the record to reflect that multiple beneficiaries have intentionally destroyed estate documents in the presence of witnesses. The room went silent so fast I could suddenly hear rain striking the windows again. Vanessa blinked twice. What does that mean? She asked. Daniel opened the folder carefully. It means, he replied, your father anticipated this possibility. Then he began reading the amendment aloud. By the second paragraph, Ethan's face had completely drained of color. By the fourth, Vanessa stopped breathing normally. And by the time Daniel reached the forfeiture clause, neither of them could even look at me anymore. Daniel read every word slowly, deliberately, as if giving the room enough time to understand the consequences before panic fully arrived. The amendment was 34 pages long, notarized, medically witnessed, and supported by competency evaluations from Richard's oncology physician confirming he was mentally fit during execution. Daniel even placed the hospital verification letter on the table beside the estate documents while Vanessa stared at it without blinking. Ethan interrupted twice trying to argue procedural validity, but Daniel calmly reminded him that threatening or disrupting formal probate proceedings would trigger additional penalties already outlined under Section 12 of the trust agreement. The confidence both of them walked into that office with began collapsing in visible stages. First denial, then anger, then calculation. I watched Ethan mentally search for leverage while Vanessa silently reread the paragraph confirming the townhouse legally transferred into my survivorship trust 2 months before Richard died, making it untouchable during probate. But the real damage came when Daniel reached the charitable foundation documents. Richard had transferred nearly 40% of his commercial real estate holdings into the Holloway Family Cancer Support Foundation, after witnessing treatment delays among uninsured patients during chemotherapy. The foundation's governing board included Daniel, Richard's business partner, and me. Vanessa finally snapped then. She manipulated him, she said, pointing directly at me across the table. This isn't what Dad wanted. Daniel didn't even look at her when he answered. He simply slid forward a typed letter Richard personally signed on October 2nd. For clarity, Daniel said quietly, your father anticipated that accusation as well. The letter was brutally direct. Richard described years of financial pressure from Ethan, emotional cruelty from Vanessa, unexplained document removals from his office, and his fear that I would be isolated immediately after his death. He wrote that I had managed his medications, appointments, business obligations, insurance disputes, feeding schedules, and hospice care while his children treated illness like an inconvenience, interrupting inheritance discussions. Vanessa started crying halfway through the second page, though even then it felt less like grief than exposure. Ethan remained completely expressionless until Daniel reached the final paragraph confirming the forfeiture clause had officially activated the moment the original will was intentionally destroyed. Under Illinois probate law, the act itself became evidence of bad faith interference with estate administration. Their inheritance reduced automatically to the mandatory minimum distribution Richard specified, $1 each. Vanessa whispered, "No." So quietly I almost didn't hear it. Ethan stood up abruptly and demanded copies of every document, every signature verification, every medical certification. Daniel informed him copies had already been forwarded electronically to probate court that morning at 8:12 a.m., including security footage from the conference room documenting the destruction of the original estate binder. That detail hit hardest, because only then did they realize this wasn't emotional revenge. It was procedural, complete, finished before they even arrived. The meeting ended less than 20 minutes later. Ethan left first without speaking to me. Vanessa stayed behind longer, standing near the window while downtown traffic crawled below through the rain. For a moment she looked smaller somehow, stripped of the certainty she carried into that room. "He loved us," she said finally, still facing the glass. I answered honestly, "He did." She turned then, eyes red and exhausted. "So why would he do this?" I looked at the torn pages still scattered across the conference table between us. Because love stops looking the same when someone spends years confusing it with entitlement. She didn't answer after that. She simply picked up her bag and walked out quietly. The strange thing is, I never felt victorious afterward. Not the way people imagine revenge feels. Mostly I felt tired. Relieved maybe. But what stayed with me most wasn't the money or the properties or even the silence that filled the room after Daniel finished reading the amendment. It was the realization that Richard saw everything long before I did. And in the end, the final thing he left me wasn't wealth. It was protection. About 6 months later, I received a certified envelope from the probate court. While sitting alone in the townhouse kitchen Richard loved most during winter mornings. Inside was the finalized estate closure order, along with confirmation that the Holloway Family Cancer Support Foundation had already approved its first 12 patient assistance grants. I remember staring at those names for a long time. People struggling to afford transportation, medication copays, temporary housing during treatment, and realizing Richard's final decision had become something larger than punishment. Ethan never contested the estate publicly after Daniel's office produced the hospital competency evaluations and conference room footage. Vanessa sent one email in February asking if she could have copies of childhood photographs from the lake house. I mailed them the following week without a note attached. No anger. No final speech. Just closure. People always imagine revenge as loud, dramatic, immediate. But sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is remain calm long enough for the truth to expose everyone for you. Richard understood that before I ever did. And maybe that's why they went silent when the second document was read. Because for the first time they realized someone had prepared for the version of them they thought nobody else could see. If you've ever stayed silent while people underestimated you, subscribe. Because some stories deserve to be heard till the very end.